Today's hearing is focused on one of the most important parts of subcommittee's oversight jurisdiction, the acquisition of goods and services by the federal government. As stewards of taxpayer dollars, we owe American citizens no less than full transparency and accountability over the federal government's operations. We need to be certain that federal assets are protected from loss or misuse. Today, we will examine the recommendations made by the Services Acquisition Advisory Panel for improving federal government acquisition practices. We will also get input in 3 bills related to contracting reform. The federal government is the largest buyer of goods and services in the world. Between 2000 and 2006, spending on government contracts has grown from almost $219 billion to $415 billion. That is an astounding 89% increase in the past 6 years. Anyone who has been paying attention to the news in recent years has heard time and time again of the waste, fraud, and abuse involving a number of government agencies and contractors. We are all familiar with the report on acquisition problems that arose in the response to Hurricane Katrina and in the reconstruction efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. These problems aren't just one-time occurrences. They often occur in routine federal acquisition projects. It is clear that our government has serious problems with the way it manages contractors and contracts. The purpose of this hearing is not just to talk about the problems with the system, but to find meaningful solutions. We want to know how we can make the system better. I'm eager to hear ideas from our witnesses on how we can improve our federal acquisition system. GAO has written numerous reports on government contracting, and likewise Ms. Marcia Madsen, legal background in contracting and her service with the panel establishes her as an expert in this area. We're delighted to have you as well. I also look forward to getting feedback from the administration and members of the contractor community on 3 contracting reform bills that we have before us today. One bill is the Government Contractor Accountability Act of 2007, which has been introduced by my good friend, Representative Chris Murphy. This bill would require disclosure of the names and salaries of top executives of companies that receive more than 80% of its annual gross revenues and more than $5 million annually from federal contracts. The Contractors and Federal Spending Accountability Act of 2007 requires a database of information on contractor performance and integrity. This bill is sponsored by Representative Maloney. The intent is to gather together in one place information from evaluations, audits, and legal proceedings, so contracting officers have a full picture of a contractor's track record. We'll also examine a bill introduced by Representative Brad Ellsworth, designed to prevent companies with seriously delinquent federal tax debt from receiving new contracts. This is a bill that Mr. Ellsworth and I worked on together, based on the input from a hearing held last April. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and gaining their perspective as we work together to find a workable solution to something that we can all agree is a continuing problem. At this time, I recognize Congressman Murphy for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you greatly for holding today's hearing. I look forward to hearing from the panel, especially with regard to how we can improve our procurement process to increase competition, establishing clear performance requirements, and improving how we measure performance. As Mr. Towns elucidated in his explanation of the bills before us today, I think it's necessary to add one more recommendation to the list of those that might be put before this committee today. And I'm pleased that we'll be able to talk about a bill presented by both myself and by another member of this subcommittee, Peter Welch. Our legislation, the Government Contractor Accountability Act, seeks one simple thing with regard to government contracting, and that is transparency. As pointed out by the GAO study, buying services accounted for 60% of the total FY 2006 procurement dollars, a staggering number. And the expenditures on security services due to our engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan have increased substantially. Obviously, the most high-profile company involved in those security services is Blackwater, subject of a major and important hearing before the full committee some months ago. And as this nation spends billions of dollars on private government contractors overseas, the American taxpayers and this Congress, as we have found out, know very little about these companies and the windfalls that they may be reaping from those contracts. Their management practices, their financial statements, and their employment policies are tightly held secrets, not subject to public scrutiny, unlike their public company brethren that are competing in many cases for the very same contracts. Not surprisingly, at that hearing in October, transparency with regard to contracts held by private companies. I think this is also an issue of putting them on par and on parity with those public companies that already disclose, both to their shareholders and to the United States government, their CEO compensation and their salary structure. Again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to have this bill before us, and I look forward to hearing from the panel on this bill and on other very important matters related to government contracting.
Right. Thank you very much. It's a long-standing policy of this committee that we swear our witnesses in, so will you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, respond by saying yes. Right. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Let me introduce our first panel. Paul Dennett is the administrator of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy at OMB, where he is the point person for the administration on issues of federal contracting and acquisitions. John Hutton is the Director of Acquisition and Sourcing Management at the Government Accountability Office. Marcia Madison served as the chair of the Services Acquisition Advisory Panel. Ms. Madison has nearly 20 years' experience in government contract law. She has served as chair of the ABA section of Public Contract Law and was also president of the Board of Contract Appeals Bar Association. Let me just indicate to you that your entire statement will be included in the record. And I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. And let me just point out one other thing. There's a light. When you start out, the light is on green. And then as you proceed, it moves to yellow. And that means that you should begin to summarize up. And then when the red comes on, that means you should shut up. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. Now that we got the rules straight, and we can move forward. Thank you. We will now begin with you, Mr. Dennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Towns, Ranking Member Bilbray, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the efforts of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy to implement the recommendations of the Acquisition Advisory Panel. You have also asked for comments on several bills. I have prepared written remarks that I would like the subcommittee to enter into the record, and you indicated that it would be. So let me briefly summarize some of those comments for you. Many of the recommendations made by the panel fit well with the priorities I have set as administrator at OFPP. These priorities include strengthening the professionalism, agility, and quality of the acquisition workforce, using competition more effectively, and ensuring good stewardship of taxpayer resources. I am happy to report that my office has either implemented or is in the process of implementing more than 40 of the 60 recommendations that the panel directed towards OFPP for action. Here is just a taste of what we have done or are doing, both as part of our efforts to implement the panel recommendations and beyond. We have launched certification programs to standardize training and experience requirements for contracting officers, their technical representatives, and our program managers. We have given agencies the tools they need to identify and close skill gaps as part of their human capital planning. We are working with regulatory drafters to come up with clear competition rules for multiple award contracts, which account for a growing percentage of our annual acquisition expenditures. We are institutionalizing results-oriented buying practices, such as strategic sourcing, where agencies work together to pursue multi-agency solutions for commonly purchased goods and services. Strategic sourcing has the potential to produce tens of millions of savings for our taxpayers in 2008. We are identifying models and best practices for agencies to get the most out of our buying tools. For example, we will soon publish a model interagency agreement to ensure agencies understand their roles and responsibilities in assisted acquisitions. We are also developing a checklist to help our professionals evaluate if their performance-based acquisitions are structured in the best manner possible. We are integrating acquisition into the formal agency internal control program outlined in OMB Circular A123 so that agencies will have a process to formally and comprehensively assess their progress on a broad range of acquisition initiatives, including those that carry out panel recommendations. With respect to improving contractor tax compliance, I am pleased to report that final changes will be made to the federal acquisition regulation in March to address how tax delinquency may be used as grounds for potential debarment or suspension. I believe this regulatory change, in combination with the ongoing efforts by the Federal Contractor Tax Compliance Task Force, will achieve the goals envisioned by the Contracting and Tax Accountability Act, H.R. 4881. I hope the subcommittee will wait to see the beneficial results of these actions before making a final decision on the need for legislation. Additional comments on the bills mentioned in your letter of invitation or in my written statement. Before concluding, I would like to acknowledge the exceptional achievements of 3 SHINE Award winners. The SHINE Initiative is another example of how we are promoting best-in-class behavior. It's the first coordinated government-wide effort dedicated exclusively to recognizing individuals and team achievements of outstanding performance within our acquisition workforce. Ms. Jean Todd of the Army Corps of Engineers supported numerous reconstruction efforts in the wake of Hurricane Katrina and Rita, including accelerated removal of water and construction of over 81,000 temporary roofs. The late Commander Philip Murphy Sweet volunteered to be the on-site contracting officer in central Iraq, supporting the establishment of a criminal investigative court and helped ensure the project stayed on track. The Bureau of Prisons acquisition team used an innovative alternative disputes resolution partnering approach in construction of a new environmentally friendly federal correctional facility on time and budget. Finally, I would like to express my appreciation for the steps Congress has taken to strengthen the workforce by making permanent the Acquisition Workforce Training Fund and extending direct hire authority. Both of these are immense help to us in strengthening the acquisition workforce. I look forward to working with the subcommittee as we continue to strengthen the acquisition process. This concludes my prepared remarks, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dennett. I'd like to just yield now for opening statement to my colleague, Congressman Davis.
Thank you. And I may not be able to stay. We've got a lot of conflicting meetings. This is a very important one today, obviously. And I want to thank you, Chairman Towns, for holding this hearing on the recommendations of the SARA panel established to review the laws and the regulations regarding the use of commercial practices, performance-based contracting, the performance of acquisition functions across agency lines of responsibility, and the use of GWACs, the government-wide contracts. As you know, the advisory panel was created by Section 1423 of the Services Acquisition Reform Act of 2003, of which I authored. The Act charged the panel with making recommendations for reforms to the acquisition system with a focus on ensuring the effective and appropriate use of commercial practices and encouraging the most innovative firms to compete in the government market. My intent was to ensure that the federal government could harness the commercial market to acquire the best value goods and services through a fair and a reasonable process. The SARA panel made a number of recommendations which I support, including those regarding the recruitment and retention of the federal acquisition workforce and the consolidation of interagency contracts. Workforce issues, by the way, are issues there is no partisan divide that we ought to be getting to work for. This is absolutely critical. Most of the major contracts that go under are because of lack of appropriate supervision and training and the like. That's something we ought to be able to move on quickly. But there are a number of recommendations I don't support. Still, the panel has helped foster a productive and a very reasoned debate, and I hope will lead to positive reforms to the federal acquisition system. Which leads me to the other focus of today's hearing. The subcommittee will also review a number of legislative proposals, all of which pertain to federal acquisition. The three bills under consideration are the Contractors and Federal Spending Accountability Act, the Government Contractor Accountability Act, and the Contracting and Tax Accountability Act. The titles of these bills more or less say it all. These proposals are not attempts to improve the government acquisition system and process, but instead focus on punishing companies conducting business with the federal government. These bills would require increased disclosure of proprietary information or limit the pool of businesses eligible to receive federal contracts. The bill sponsors presumably believe they're promoting the interests of the federal government by championing these reforms because there have been press reports in recent years of bad conduct by certain companies doing business with the federal government. However well-intentioned, though, these proposals don't focus on creating the most effective and efficient federal acquisition system possible, and instead will have a chilling effect upon firms wishing to participate in the federal marketplace. This could result in decreased competition for federal contracts as companies decide doing business with the federal government is not really worth the price. At this crucial time, we should be seeking ways to bring more companies into the federal marketplace, making it easier for them to participate, demanding more competition to ensure that American taxpayers receive the most for their precious tax dollars. It's unclear to me how any of these proposals improve the federal procurement system. If anything, I think they're a step in the wrong direction. It's ironic that while we focus today on the panel's efforts to improve the system, not one of the proposals we're considering today has any relationship to the panel's recommendations. There's nothing here to remedy poorly defined requirements, which lead to so many acquisition failures. Nothing here, by the way, to look at the security clearance backlog, which is a huge problem where the federal government is paying a price. Security clearances are almost a commodity today because of the scarcity of them and the inability of the government to move them through the process. Nothing will provide us with a sufficient number of acquisition-trained professionals with the right skills to select the best contractor and manage contract performance, probably the number one change we can make to bring about improvements to the system. That being said, it's important we hear from the witnesses and today on the legislation and from the panel of experts on the recommendations of the SARA panel. And Chairman Towns, I look forward to continued robust discussion on this and to seeing you in Columbia this weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. At this time, I yield to Congressman Duncan from Tennessee for opening statement. Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Then we now go to you, Mr. Hutton.
Chairman Towns and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to discuss our recent report on the Acquisition Advisory Panel's findings and recommendations. In 2003, Congress established the panel to review acquisition laws and regulations and to make recommendations to improve the federal acquisition practices. The panel issued its report last year and made recommendations covering 7 areas, including commercial practices in the federal acquisition workforce. The panel directed most of its recommendations to the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, while others were directed to Congress and federal agencies. In view of our past work and broad institutional knowledge, we were asked to review the panel's findings and recommendations. The panel's results are important to consider given that each year the federal government spends billions of dollars to procure goods and services. In fiscal year 2006, it spent over $400 billion, and services now account for about 60% of the total procurement dollars. At your request, my testimony today will highlight how the panel findings and recommendations compare with our past work and OFPP's plans to address the panel's recommendations. Overall, the panel's findings and recommendations are largely consistent with our past work. Like the panel, our past work has pointed out the need for competition, the need for clear performance requirements, measurable performance standards, and quality assurance plans to improve the use of performance-based acquisitions, the risks inherent in the use of interagency contracts because of the rapid growth and their improper management, the stresses on the federal acquisition workforce and the need for a strategic approach to assess workforce needs, concerns about contractors engaged in activities traditionally performed by government employees and the proper roles for contractor employees in a blended workforce, and finally, the adverse effects of inaccurate federal procurement data that cannot be relied on to conduct procurement analyses. I will now highlight a couple of areas the panel reviewed, the general thrust of the panel's recommendations, and our views on them. One area the panel focused on was commercial practices. The panel noted that the bedrock principle of commercial acquisitions is competition. It found that defining requirements is key to achieving the benefits of competition, and that procurements with clear requirements are far more likely to produce competitive, fixed-price offers that meet customers' needs. Further, the panel found that commercial organizations use multidisciplinary teams to plan their procurements, conduct competition for award, and monitor the contractor performance. And the recommendations included, among other things, that the requirements process be improved and competitive procedures be strengthened. Our work is generally consistent with these panel's results, and we have issued numerous products that address the importance of well-defined requirements and the need for competition. Our past work has shown that poorly defined or broadly described requirements complicate the efforts to hold agencies and contractors accountable for poor acquisition outcomes. Further, our reports have noted the lack of competition in acquisition of goods and services. The panel also focused on the federal acquisition workforce. It recognized the significant mismatch between the demands placed on the workforce and the personnel and skills available within the workforce to meet those demands. For example, the panel found that workforce demands have grown substantially, while at the same time the complexity of the federal acquisition system as a whole has increased. Accordingly, the panel made a number of recommendations designed to define, assess, train, and collect data on the acquisition workforce, the recruitment of talented personnel, and the retainment of its senior workforce. Again, our work is generally consistent with the panel's findings. For example, our work at DoD has shown that effective workforce skills were essential for ensuring that DoD receives fair and reasonable prices for the goods and services it buys. We also noted increased demands on the acquisition workforce as one of a number of conditions that increase DoD's vulnerabilities to contracting waste and abuse. We presently have ongoing work focusing on acquisition workforce issues at DoD, DHS, and NASA. Now, turning to OFPP's efforts to address the recommendations, OFPP has acted on some while other actions are pending or under consideration. Generally, it expects implementation of the recommendation to fall into broad categories of legislative actions, changes to the federal acquisition regulations, OFPP actions such as issuing or revising policy, and federal agency action. OFPP noted that legislative actions and pending FAR cases could address about 1/3 of the recommendations, and they expect to address most of the remaining and plan to work with the chief acquisition officer or senior procurement officials within each agency to do so. Mr. Chairman, OFPP, as the lead agency for responding to the panel report, is now in a key position to help sustain the panel's work. In some cases, it has established milestones for reporting requirements to help provide it with visibility over the progress and results of implementing the recommendations, but not for all. As such, we recommended that OFPP work with the chief acquisition officers and senior procurement officials to lay out an overall strategy or plan to help it gauge how the panel's recommendations are being implemented and how they improve federal acquisitions. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, this concludes my statement, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hutton. Ms. Mattson.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to talk about the Acquisition Advisory Panel.
Your mic on? I don't think, push the button there.
I'm sorry. Thank you for inviting us, and Mr. Davis did a good job of summing up the panel's charter. Sometimes people think that we were tasked to look at the entire acquisition process, so I always feel compelled to talk about what the panel's charter was, which was commercial practices, performance-based contracting, and use of interagency contracts. I should recognize that there are two other panel members with me here today sitting behind me, Mr. Ty Hughes, a Deputy General Counsel for the Air Force for Acquisition, and Mr. Roger Waldron, formerly of GSA. And also, several of our panel staff came today, Laura Oletta, who was our Executive Director, Ms. Ann Terry, and Mr. Eric Cho. It's no small challenge to sum up the panel's report in 5 minutes, but I'll be happy to try to do that. I actually need one of these timers at home. I think it'd be a great idea. With respect to commercial practices, the one thing I think that we did differently is nobody's really looked at commercial practices in about 10 years since FAST or FARA were enacted. So we asked big commercial buyers to come and talk to the panel about what works for them in acquisition of services. And the things they emphasized to us were requirements, that's where they invest, requirements definition, and competition. And that's what our recommendations reflect. And I think most of our recommendations actually in this area have been picked up in the Defense Authorization Act and in S680. And we're very happy about that progress. On interagency contracts, we recommended a number of steps to improve the management of interagency contracts. Our findings and recommendations recognize that they're important to helping the government meet its mission, but that there were significant issues with proliferation and failure, really, of management between agencies that own those vehicles and agencies that use them. So we have a number of recommendations there. Again, many of those have been picked up in pending legislation. I was asked specifically to address our workforce recommendations. Although they're not called out in the statute specifically, we felt that we couldn't do our work justice without talking about the federal acquisition workforce. The panel determined that there was a significant mismatch between the demands placed on the workforce and the personnel and skills available to meet those demands, but we also realized after a lot of work that there wasn't much in the way of reliable information about the size, competencies, and composition of the federal acquisition workforce, or I might add of contractors supporting that workforce. One can't understand the trends that have affected the workforce without adequate data. So we commissioned a study, the executive summary of which I've provided a copy to the staff. It's actually available in a 9-CD set. We're happy to provide the whole thing to you if you want to take a look at it. But our recommendations start with prompt and aggressive action to improve the workforce, consistent definitions, a single government-wide database, and an emphasis on human capital planning by the agencies. And I'd like to add, again, a number of these recommendations have been picked up in the Defense Authorization Bill as well as in S680, including the importance of providing funds, which are in the Workforce Development Fund and the SARA Training Fund, both of which are in the National Defense Authorization Act, and the SARA Training Fund made permanent, which is in S680. We did not recommend that agencies rush out and hire scores of new acquisition professionals because we did not have enough information to tell us the relationship between numbers of acquisition professionals and competencies of those people, gaps in skills, and the use of contractors. But we did state that a flexible planning process should be used and begun immediately so that changes could be made available, could begin as soon as information was available. And DOD, OFPP's recently completed a workforce assessment process, and DOD's got one underway. Again, although not called out in the statute, the panel also determined that our findings and recommendations would have an impact on small business. So we set up a cross-cutting working group to take a look at small business issues. And we recognize that particularly the growth of task and delivery order contracts for multi-agency use have created challenges for small businesses. This is because basically most of the small business laws were written in the era before it became common practice to use these contracts that have a delivery order or task order mechanism. So we have some recommendations in our report to deal with this issue, including statutory revisions that would allow contracting officers to reserve a portion of awards in a full and open competition for small businesses. We also recommended express authority to reserve orders for competition among the small business contract holders only. I'd be happy to answer more questions about the panel's findings and recommendations when you all are ready to ask them. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much and, for your testimony. Let me begin with you, Mr. Dennett. In your testimony, you discussed that you have started the process of implementing most of the changes recommended by the SARA panel. And I think GAO and SARA panel agree that you are off to a good start. But I want more details on how you will finish the job. You know, I understand you're off to a good start, but is there time tables or for the changes to be finalized? I mean, could you just tell us more about it?
Sure. Many of them are going to be put in our federal acquisition regulation, and that's a process. It's a deliberative process where we go out, we propose it, we get comments from industry, citizenry, and everybody else. After we call through all of that and complete the analysis, then we issue regulations. So we have groups both within the Defense Department and the civilian agencies that spend a lot of time and months on that. So those will be coming out almost every month. Every month there's a new issuance, which includes more and more of them. I think one of the most important things we're going to be doing for tracking a lot of this is, I'm pretty excited about this, is we're going to include an acquisition component in the existing OMB Circular A123, where departments go out and check on their progress on a wide range of management things and see what they're accomplishing. We're going to have a detailed listing of all our things that we want tracked in the acquisition area, and individual departments, when they go out and make their field visits and checks, they will now for the first time incorporate acquisition into that to tell us if in fact the policies that we're putting out to implement the SARA panel in fact are being done by the agencies in the field.
So have you ranked them in order of priority in terms of your recommendations in order of priority? Have you ranked them?
Not a specific ranking. We've of the 60 that are pointed towards us, over 70% of them we've already moved out on and are taking action. Of the remaining ones, we have work groups analyzing it to make a recommendation to us as to which ones we should aggressively implement, or which ones we might be coming back to you, talking more with Marcia and others to better understand, to see if in fact we should move out on those.
Right.
You know, like one is like the creation of the Federal Acquisition University. That was one that I was hoping to get more guidance in terms of let's do it, but that recommendation said let's study it. So we will study it, but that's one that I view favorably, and I can see a lot of benefits of having a Federal Acquisition University.
Right. Thank you. I guess this is you, Mr. Mattson, and also Ms. Mattson, and also Mr. Hutton. Everyone agrees that there are serious issues with the acquisition workforce. Of course, there are a lot of questions throughout government about how to fill the gaps when large number of baby boomers start to retire. How are these issues for the acquisition workforce similar or different than the issues of the overall federal workforce?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure I feel competent to comment on the overall federal workforce, but with respect to the acquisition workforce, certainly one of the things that we saw, and it's very visible in the data collection that we did, is that in the mid-90s, and just to use DOD as an example, the acquisition workforce at DOD was cut by 50%. It looks like maybe acquisition jobs were viewed as expendable because of the post-Cold War defense build-down. And the problem with that is, of course, no one anticipated what was going to happen on September 11th, and that we would be in the situation we are today, where we've got sort of a convergence of a very complex acquisition system and not enough people. And not only that, I think probably not enough people with the right skill set. I mean, one of the things the panel report points out is that 60% of the federal procurement budget today, including at the Department of Defense, is being spent on services. A lot of those are complex IT-related services. Much of it are services that are purchased in the commercial sector, and it may well be that there's a different skill set than the traditional acquisition skill set that's required. That's why our recommendations talk about doing an assessment, doing very capable human capital planning, and making decisions about where agencies' core needs are and what kinds of people they need before just making, in adding to the number of traditional procurement people who they employ.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just to build on that response, GAO does look at human capital issues across government, and I think more broadly there are issues government-wide, but GAO has offered various principles that one can use to look at the human capital situation in government. And Ms. Madsen has mentioned some of the key components, but having a human capital strategy where you're trying to identify what are the missions and how are you going to conduct those missions, what kind of skills and abilities do you need, how many do you need, and whether even to the extent to which these are things that you need for issues that are more tasks that the government employees ought to be doing versus contractors. I think the human capital strategy is probably an underpinning to get at not only the government-wide issues, but I think some of the things that we're talking about here today with respect to acquisition workforce.
Right. Yes.
I'd like to build on that also. I mean, I believe the acquisition area, one of the reasons that perhaps we're worse than some of the other functions is because people that know acquisition are so employable. Private industry has a lot of need for people that really know how to do contracting. So we really have to take initiatives to bring in new blood. We've launched an aggressive intern coalition where we're taking in over 500-600 new people out of college each year to help fill the pipeline. But and we've gotten big help in two areas already from Congress. One is direct hire authority now, where we can hire people more rapidly because we're competing with industry. And when somebody has to wait several months before they actually get a job offer, that puts us at a big disadvantage. By giving us the direct hire authority, that helps us a lot. The other is for us to re-employ annuitants. When they retire, they used to have their retirement money taken away from them. Now we're allowed to hire newly retired acquisition people to come back and assist us with the training and filling in some of the holes while we get staffed up adequately.
Right. Thank you very much. Congressman Duncan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just make a couple of comments. I remember several years ago, Governor Rendell of Pennsylvania, when he was mayor of Philadelphia, he testified in front of a subcommittee here in the Congress, and he said the problem with government is that he said there's no incentive for people to work hard, so many do not. There's no incentive to save money, so much of it is squandered. And because of that, we found out years ago that we could get almost anything done in the federal government by private contractors more cheaply, efficiently, quicker, and so forth by going to private contractors. Now, what's happened, though, over the last few years, and the chairman did a real good job in his opening statement, these contracts have been exploding over the last 6 years, and we're continually reading stories about the waste, the fraud, and abuse that the chairman mentioned, and just excessive, ridiculous, exorbitant profits. These government contracts have become the most profitable contracts, far exceeding profits that companies would make in the private sector. So now some of these contractors are about to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. It started most heavily and can be seen most vividly in the Defense Department. The International Tribune had an article about the revolving door at the Pentagon. We found out the defense contractors were hiring all the retired admirals and generals, but then it started going to all the departments and agencies where they would hire these retired high-level federal employees. Then these companies would go back and get these contracts, so that it was beginning to look to some of us that every major federal contract was a sweetheart deal of some sort or another. And I want to read to you something I had in one of my last newsletters. The Washington Post carried a front-page story reporting that one no-bid $2 million contract awarded by the Department of Homeland Security in 2003 ballooned up to $124 million by July of this year. In December of 2004, department lawyers said payments to Booz Allen Hamilton, one of the largest federal contractors, to provide consultants had gone, quote, grossly beyond the scope, unquote, of the original contract. The lawyers advised the department to allow other companies to compete. At that point, payments had reached $30 million. The competition did not take place for more than a year. During that time, payments under a no-bid arrangement went to $73 million. Then DHS broke it up into 5 contracts totaling $51 million. Shock of all shocks, Booz Allen Hamilton won, quote, competition for all 5 contracts, thus adding up to $124 million so far. And then I added the Department of Homeland Security has apparently turned into a very lucrative gravy train for some people. Now, first of all, I appreciate the fact that Congressman Murphy's here, because I want to co-sponsor your bill. I think, and put me down on that. But these things are getting out of control. And it seems to me there's 2 major problems. Most federal bureaucrats, I think that it's easier and they feel more important if they're dealing with one big, huge, giant company instead of 100 small companies. But you've got to get more competition into these contracts, for one thing. And then we've got to put some restrictions or limitations of some sort on the revolving door that we're getting in every department and agency, where all these federal contracts are sweetheart deals that are going to high-level federal employees who've retired and gone to work in the private sector, and then those companies are coming back getting those contracts. These things are getting ridiculously out of control, and the profits are just almost obscene, and it's just totally unfair to the taxpayers. And so, you know, I was going to ask for your comments. Unfortunately, we've got this vote going on, so I'll try to come back in a little bit and hear what you have to say. But it seems to me that those are the problems, and they're really getting to be very, very serious. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
For the inconvenience, but we have 1 vote on the House floor, so it's our intention to take a short recess and then reconvene here for further questioning in about 10 minutes.
Yeah.